Picture this: you strike gold after months of backbreaking work. You followed every rule, filed your claim properly, worked yourself to exhaustion. You're finally going to escape poverty. Then a man in an expensive suit shows up with hired guns, a forged deed, and a judge in his pocket. By sunset, your claim belongs to him, and you're left with nothing but the choice to accept it or die trying to fight back. This wasn't a rare tragedy in early California. This was the system. This was how things worked when the rich and ruthless controlled everything: the land, the courts, the law enforcement, the government itself. They didn't just have more money than you. They had rigged the entire game so thoroughly that honest work meant almost nothing and ruthless theft meant everything. You think America's Gilded Age robber barons were bad? Early California was their training ground, their laboratory, the place where they perfected the art of using law as a weapon against ordinary people while operating above that same law themselves. The men who got rich in California's gold rush era didn't do it by working harder or being smarter. They did it by controlling the systems of power: courts, sheriffs, land offices, city governments, and using that control to legally steal from everyone else. This is the story of how a small class of wealthy, ruthless men seized control of early California and built their fortunes not through enterprise or innovation, but through systematic exploitation, legal manipulation, and outright theft, dressed up in the clothing of legitimate business and government. They controlled who owned land, who got justice, who succeeded and who failed, who lived comfortably and who died in poverty. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand exactly how the rich and ruthless controlled early California, the specific mechanisms they used to maintain that control, and what it meant for the thousands of ordinary people who came to California dreaming of opportunity, but found instead a system designed to extract their labor and wealth for the benefit of a tiny elite. The California dream. For most people, it was a nightmare designed by the rich to make themselves richer. To understand how the rich and ruthless controlled early California, you need to understand the specific conditions between 1848 and the 1870s that made such total control possible. January 1848. Gold is discovered at Sutter's mill. At this moment, California is a newly seized American territory with about 15,000 non-indigenous settlers. It has no functioning American government, no established legal system, no institutions, no infrastructure. It's a blank slate, and whoever gets there first with money and connections will write the rules. Within months, word of gold spreads globally. By 1849, over 100,000 people flood into California. By 1852, the population exceeds 250,000. This demographic explosion creates perfect conditions for the rich and ruthless to seize control, because there's no established power structure to resist them. Here's why that mattered. In established states, there were already institutions, laws, social structures, and distribution of power that limited what the wealthy could do. In California, there was nothing. The men with capital and ruthless ambition could literally create the institutions of government and law to serve their interests, because they were the ones with money to fund those institutions and the connections to staff them. California didn't become a state until 1850, and even then, the state government was immediately captured by the wealthy. The first legislators, judges, and officials were either wealthy men themselves, or were beholden to wealthy backers who'd funded their campaigns. The government wasn't created to serve the public. It was created to serve the elite who'd paid for it. The federal government was 3,000 miles and 3 months away. Federal oversight of California was minimal to non-existent. The wealthy California elite could operate with almost no federal interference, giving them free rein to structure California's legal and economic systems to their benefit. The geography created natural monopolies that the rich exploited ruthlessly. California was isolated, surrounded by mountains, deserts, and ocean. Getting goods into California required either a months-long sea voyage around Cape Horn or a deadly overland journey. The merchants who controlled these supply routes could charge whatever they wanted because there was no competition. Water was scarce in much of California, especially in the mining regions. Whoever controlled water sources controlled mining, agriculture, and settlement. The rich quickly monopolized water rights and used that control to extract wealth from everyone who needed water to survive or do business. Land ownership was chaos that the rich exploited perfectly. Mexican land grants existed but weren't clearly documented. The land commission created to adjudicate these claims was dominated by Americans who had every incentive to rule against Mexican owners. The rich hired lawyers and bribed officials to steal millions of acres from legitimate owners. The population composition favored the rich. Early California was overwhelmingly young, single men with no families, no long-term community ties, no social connections. They were isolated individuals competing against organized, wealthy elites with capital, legal representation, and political connections. It wasn't a fair fight. The men who would control California arrived with advantages the masses didn't have. They had capital to invest. They had business experience. They had legal knowledge or could hire lawyers. They had social connections to other wealthy men. They understood that real power came not from mining gold themselves, but from controlling the systems through which gold flowed. These men, merchants like Sam Brannan, land speculators like William Gwynn, railroad magnates like the Big Four, banking families like the Floods and Fairs, they understood immediately that California was an opportunity for wealth extraction on an unprecedented scale. They just needed to control the machinery of power. And they did. They bought political offices through funding campaigns and bribing voters. They installed their allies as judges. They used their newspapers to shape public opinion. They hired private armies to enforce their will. They wrote laws that benefited themselves and punished their competitors. By the time ordinary miners and settlers realized what was happening, it was too late. The rich had already captured California's government, courts, and economy. The system was rigged, and it was rigged by design by the rich and ruthless men who'd created it. This was the setup: a massive territory with no established institutions, a flood of disconnected individuals competing for resources, enormous wealth up for grabs, and a small class of wealthy, organized, ruthless men who understood that controlling the system was more profitable than participating in it honestly. The stage was set for total elite control. The daily reality of trying to survive in early California revealed how completely the rich controlled even the most basic necessities of life, turning survival itself into a profit opportunity for the elite. You needed somewhere to live. In a society where the rich didn't control everything, housing would be built by a mix of owners, with competition keeping prices reasonable. In early California, wealthy land speculators controlled most of the valuable urban land in places like San Francisco. They could charge whatever rent they wanted because they owned the limited supply. A tiny room in San Francisco could cost $200 per month in 1850, about $6,000 in today's money, because wealthy landlords monopolized housing and new miners had no choice but to pay. They weren't providing better housing for that price. They were extracting maximum profit from people who had nowhere else to go. The rich controlled land not just through ownership, but through the corrupt legal system they'd created. If you tried to squat on empty land to build shelter, wealthy landowners would use their tame sheriffs to evict you. If you bought land and it turned out the deed was questionable, the wealthy buyer who wanted it could take you to court before a judge they'd appointed, and you'd lose. Water access showed elite control at its most brutal. In San Francisco, wealthy men owned the water companies that monopolized supply. They charged outrageous rates, 50 cents for a bucket of water, about $15 today. The water was often contaminated because the wealthy owners cared more about profit than quality, but you had to buy it anyway. In mining districts, the wealthy controlled water through legal manipulation. They'd claim water rights, build dams and flumes, then sell water to miners at prices that ate up most of the miners' profits. If you protested, they'd cut off your water supply and watch your claim become worthless. The rich didn't just control water, they weaponized it. Hydraulic mining operations owned by wealthy companies would blast hillsides with high-pressure water, sending millions of tons of sediment into rivers, destroying farmland and water supplies for hundreds of miles downstream. Farmers sued, but the wealthy mining companies had better lawyers and bribed judges. The destruction continued for decades. Food supply was dominated by merchant monopolies that fixed prices and adulterated products. A handful of wealthy merchants controlled most of the import trade. They'd coordinate prices so you had no choice but to pay their rates. They'd mix sawdust into flour, water down whiskey, sell spoiled meat as fresh. There was no regulation because the wealthy controlled the government that would regulate them. Fresh food was nearly impossible to get because the wealthy didn't invest in local agriculture. They made more money importing expensive goods. This caused scurvy epidemics that killed thousands. The rich didn't care because they could afford fresh food shipped specially for them. Your health wasn't their concern. Your money was. The daily survival struggle showed how the rich had structured California to extract wealth from ordinary people at every turn. You paid inflated rent to wealthy landlords, bought overpriced food from wealthy merchants, paid for water controlled by wealthy monopolists, and lived on land whose ownership was determined by wealthy controlled courts. Every basic necessity was a profit opportunity for the elite. They weren't providing these services better or more efficiently. They were using their control of land, supply chains, legal systems, and water to extract maximum wealth from people who had no alternatives. The rich lived in mansions while you lived in tents or shacks. They ate fresh fruit while you got scurvy. They had clean water while you drank contaminated water that made you sick. The class division wasn't subtle. It was glaring, obvious, and maintained through the elite's total control of the systems that distributed resources. The work and economic systems of early California revealed most clearly how the rich and ruthless controlled ordinary people's lives and extracted their labor and wealth. Mining, supposedly the great equalizer where anyone could strike it rich, was actually a system designed to transfer wealth from workers to wealthy claim owners and merchants. The popular image is the independent miner with his pan, finding gold and keeping the profits. The reality is that most miners worked for wealthy claim owners who paid them wages while keeping the gold. The wages seemed high, maybe $5.10 per day in gold, but that was meaningless when the wealthy controlled prices. That $10 in wages would be spent on $3 for breakfast at a restaurant owned by the wealthy, $5 for supplies at a store owned by the wealthy, and $2 for a tent space on land owned by the wealthy. You worked all day and ended with nothing because the wealthy had structured the economy to flow wealth to themselves. The miners who did own claims weren't free from elite control. The wealthy controlled water necessary for mining. They controlled the equipment and supplies you needed. They controlled the merchants who bought your gold. They controlled the legal system that determined ownership disputes. You might own a claim on paper, but in practice, you operated within a system completely controlled by the rich. Claim jumping showed elite control at its most blatant. A miner would work a claim for months, following all the rules. Then a wealthy speculator would show up with a forged deed or a legal technicality, backed by hired guns and a tame judge. The miner would lose everything to a rich man who'd done no mining at all but controlled the legal system. The courts that adjudicated mining disputes were controlled by the wealthy. Judges were appointed by wealthy politicians or elected through campaigns funded by the wealthy. Lawyers represented the wealthy because poor miners couldn't afford legal fees. The justice system delivered justice to whoever paid for it. Wage labor in industries controlled by the wealthy was exploitation without recourse. The Central Pacific Railroad, owned by the Big Four, Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, and Crocker, worked Chinese laborers under deadly conditions for poverty wages. These wealthy railroad magnates made fortunes while paying workers barely enough to survive, knowing the workers had no legal protections and no alternatives. The wealthy railroad owners didn't just underpay workers, they used government power to enrich themselves. They received massive federal land grants and subsidies, essentially having taxpayers fund their private fortunes. They bribed legislators to get favorable laws. They used their political power to prevent labor organizing. They were extracting wealth from workers, taxpayers, and the government simultaneously. Banking and credit were controlled by wealthy families who used that control to maintain economic dominance. The wealthy could get credit easily and cheaply. Ordinary people either couldn't get credit at all or paid usurious rates. This meant the wealthy could invest and expand while ordinary people struggled to accumulate capital. When banks failed, which happened frequently, wealthy owners often escaped with their personal fortunes while ordinary depositors lost everything. The wealthy had insider knowledge and could withdraw funds before collapses. The poor had no protection and no recourse when their savings disappeared. Land speculation was wealth extraction dressed as business. Wealthy speculators would grab vast tracts of land through political connections, legal manipulation, or outright theft. They'd hold it while population growth increased values, then sell at enormous profits. They created no value. They just controlled land and extracted wealth from people who needed it. The Land Commission that adjudicated Mexican land grants was a theft machine operated by the wealthy. It required Mexican owners to prove claims through expensive American legal proceedings. The wealthy hired lawyers to challenge legitimate claims and bribed judges to rule in their favor. Millions of acres were stolen from Mexican families and given to wealthy American speculators. The class divide this created was extreme and permanent. The wealthy got wealthier by controlling systems that extracted wealth from workers. Workers stayed poor no matter how hard they worked because the wealthy had structured the economy to flow wealth upward. A merchant like Sam Brannan could arrive in California with some capital, use it to monopolize supplies during the gold rush, and become a millionaire within years, not through hard work, but through exploiting his control of supply chains and his political connections. Meanwhile, a miner could work himself to disability, follow every rule, and die in poverty because the systems controlling water, supplies, land, and legal ownership were all designed to extract his wealth and transfer it to the rich. The economic system proved the title. The rich and ruthless controlled early California by controlling every system through which wealth flowed. They didn't compete fairly. They rigged the game through legal control, monopoly power, and political corruption. The public health catastrophe in early California showed how the rich and ruthless prioritized their own profits over the lives of ordinary people, leading to preventable deaths on a massive scale. Disease killed thousands in ways that revealed class control. Cholera epidemics swept through California in the early 1850s, killing primarily the poor who drank contaminated water. The wealthy could afford clean water from private sources or boiled water. The poor drank from contaminated public sources because the wealthy who controlled water companies cared more about profits than public health. The wealthy water company owners knew their water was contaminated. They knew it was spreading disease. They continued selling it anyway because fixing the problem would cost money. The poor died while the wealthy owners counted their profits and lived in neighborhoods with better water access. The lack of public health infrastructure was a choice made by the wealthy who controlled government. Building sewers, ensuring clean water, and establishing health regulations would require taxes on the wealthy. They used their political control to prevent such taxation, so public health systems weren't built and poor people died from preventable disease. Workplace deaths revealed the wealthy's complete disregard for worker lives. Mining companies owned by wealthy investors killed workers through negligence, inadequate shoring, unsafe explosives, lack of safety equipment. The wealthy owners faced no legal consequences because they controlled the legal system. The Central Pacific Railroad killed hundreds of Chinese workers during construction. The wealthy owners knew the work was deadly. They could have implemented safety measures. Instead, they calculated that paying minimal wages and accepting high worker deaths was more profitable than protecting worker safety. Workers died so the Big Four could maximize their fortunes. The wealthy didn't just fail to prevent worker deaths, they actively fought against any measures that would reduce deaths but cost them money. When workers tried to organize for safer conditions, the wealthy used their control of law enforcement to break up organizing efforts. Worker safety was sacrificed to elite profits. Medical care access was divided by class in ways that killed the poor. The wealthy could afford trained doctors and quality medicine. The poor relied on quacks and fraudulent treatments because they couldn't afford better. The wealthy controlled medical licensing, such as it existed, and they didn't care that poor people were being killed by incompetent providers. The wealthy even profited from poor people's deaths. Undertaking was controlled by wealthy families who charged the poor exorbitant rates for basic burials. Even death was a profit opportunity for the rich. The mercury poisoning from hydraulic mining showed the wealthy's willingness to poison entire populations for profit. Wealthy mining companies contaminated water supplies with mercury for decades, causing neurological damage to thousands of people downstream. They knew it was happening. They continued anyway because stopping would reduce profits. When victims sued, the wealthy mining companies used their control of courts to delay and defeat lawsuits for decades. They had the money for endless appeals and legal battles. Their victims did. The poisoning continued while the wealthy protected their profits through the legal system they controlled. The mortality rate in early California was shockingly high, especially among the poor. This wasn't random misfortune. It was the predictable result of wealthy elites prioritizing profit over human life. They controlled water companies that poisoned people. They owned workplaces that killed workers. They prevented public health measures that would have saved lives. They controlled courts that prevented accountability. The rich didn't die at the same rates. They lived in better neighborhoods with better sanitation. They worked in safe offices rather than deadly mines. They could afford good medical care. They lived while the poor died, and that difference was maintained through the elite's control of every system that affected health and safety. The death toll was a choice made by wealthy elites who valued their profits more than poor people's lives, and who had enough control over California's systems that they could make that choice without consequence. The crime and violence in early California revealed how the rich and ruthless controlled law enforcement and the justice system to protect themselves while leaving ordinary people vulnerable and exploited. Law enforcement served the wealthy, not the public. Sheriffs were elected officials who needed campaign funding, and the wealthy provided it. In return, sheriffs protected wealthy interests and ignored crimes against the poor. If a wealthy landowner's property was threatened, the sheriff would respond immediately with force. If a poor miner was robbed, the sheriff wouldn't bother investigating. The San Francisco police force was notoriously corrupt, and the corruption served the wealthy. Police would protect businesses owned by wealthy merchants while ignoring crimes in poor neighborhoods. They'd break up labor organizing that threatened wealthy employers. They'd evict squatters from land wealthy speculators wanted. The police weren't neutral law enforcers. They were armed servants of the elite. The court system was a tool of elite control masquerading as justice. Judges were appointed by wealthy politicians or elected through campaigns funded by the wealthy. They ruled consistently in favor of wealthy litigants against poor defendants. A poor person suing a wealthy person faced a court system designed to protect wealth, not deliver justice. The wealthy could literally buy verdicts. Judges took bribes, not secretly, but openly, because there was no oversight system to punish them. Juries were tampered with through bribery and intimidation. The wealthy had lawyers who knew how to manipulate the corrupt system. The poor had no representation and no chance. The Land Commission cases showed judicial corruption serving the wealthy perfectly. Mexican landowners with legitimate claims would lose to American speculators with questionable claims, Because the American speculators bribed the officials deciding the cases. Millions of acres were stolen through a legal system controlled by the wealthy thieves doing the stealing. The vigilante movements, supposedly citizen justice, were actually elite power grabs. The San Francisco Vigilance Committees of 1851 and 1856 were organized and funded by wealthy merchants. They claimed to fight crime, but really they were establishing their own control over the city outside even the pretense of democratic government. The vigilantes hanged some actual criminals, but they also used their power to exile business competitors, intimidate political opponents, and crush labor organizing. They weren't restoring justice. They were replacing one system they didn't fully control with another system they controlled completely. The fact that thousands of citizens supported vigilantism proved how completely the official justice system had failed ordinary people. But the vigilantes weren't serving ordinary people either. They were serving the wealthy merchants who organized and funded them. Property crime showed class-based enforcement clearly. If a poor person stole from a wealthy person, they'd be pursued, caught, and punished harshly. If a wealthy person stole from a poor person, through legal manipulation, fraud, or force, there were no consequences because the wealthy controlled the system. Claim jumping by wealthy speculators was theft, legally speaking, but it was rarely prosecuted because the wealthy controlled prosecutors and courts. Meanwhile, poor people accused of petty theft faced the full weight of the law. Justice wasn't blind. It was looking directly at your bank account. Violence by the wealthy was legal while violence against the wealthy was harshly punished. Wealthy landowners could hire private armies to evict squatters or intimidate workers. This violence was legal and protected. Workers who fought back were arrested and prosecuted. The state's monopoly on violence was really the wealthy's monopoly. The racial violence that killed hundreds of Chinese, Mexican, and Native American Californians was enabled by wealthy-controlled systems that refused to protect minorities. Chinese immigrants couldn't testify against white defendants, a law that served wealthy employers who could exploit Chinese workers without legal consequences. When white mobs attacked Chinese neighborhoods, the wealthy-controlled police did nothing because the wealthy employers benefited from keeping Chinese workers vulnerable and unable to demand better treatment. The violence maintained the racial hierarchy that allowed wealthy employers to exploit Chinese labor. The genocide of Native Californians was funded by the state government controlled by the wealthy. Bounties for Native American scalps were paid from taxes, essentially making taxpayers fund murder that served wealthy settlers who wanted native land. The wealthy controlled the government that authorized and funded genocide. The crime and violence patterns proved elite control. The wealthy used law enforcement to protect themselves and their property while leaving ordinary people unprotected. They used courts to legitimize their theft while punishing poor people's crimes. They used violence through private armies and compliant police to maintain their power. The entire legal system was a tool of class control, not impartial justice. The treatment of the most vulnerable populations revealed how ruthlessly the wealthy elite controlled California and how completely they prioritized profit over human welfare. Women's legal powerlessness served the wealthy's interests. Married women had no property rights. Their assets became their husbands upon marriage. This wasn't accidental. It was a legal structure that concentrated property and wealth in male hands, and the wealthy men who controlled the legal system had no interest in changing it. The wealthy profited directly from women's lack of rights. When wealthy men married women with property, they gained total control of that property. Widows of wealthy men often lost everything to male relatives or business partners because the legal system gave them no protection. The trafficking of women into forced prostitution was a profit industry that the wealthy enabled through legal indifference. Brothel owners, some of them wealthy, all of them politically connected, enslaved women and faced no legal consequences because the wealthy controlled police and courts looked the other way. Chinese women were particularly victimized because they had no legal standing at all. They couldn't testify in court, couldn't own property, couldn't seek legal protection. This made them perfect victims for traffickers who could enslave them with impunity. The legal system the wealthy controlled essentially authorized this enslavement through indifference. The wealthy didn't just enable trafficking, some participated directly. Wealthy men visited brothels where enslaved women worked. They knew the women were enslaved. They didn't care because their wealth and social position protected them from consequences. Children were exploited for labor in ways that benefited the wealthy and destroyed young lives. Child labor was legal and common because the wealthy who controlled the legislature refused to pass protective laws. Children worked in deadly conditions, mines, factories, farms, for poverty wages that enriched wealthy owners. The wealthy railroad owners worked Chinese children alongside adults in deadly construction. The wealthy factory owners worked white children in dangerous machinery. The wealthy landowners worked Mexican children in agricultural labor. Child exploitation served elite profits, so the legal system protected it. Orphans, created in large numbers by California's high mortality rate, were particularly vulnerable to wealthy exploitation. Under the apprenticeship system, wealthy families could take custody of orphans and force them to work without pay until adulthood. This was legal slavery that benefited the wealthy and destroyed children's lives. The system was enforced by wealthy-controlled courts that would side with the wealthy guardians over the children being exploited. Orphans had no voice, no protection, no recourse against wealthy families using them as unpaid labor. Chinese immigrants faced systematic exploitation that served wealthy employers' interests perfectly. The foreign miners, tax extracted wealth from Chinese miners, with the revenue funding a government controlled by wealthy white Californians. The tax was enforced through violence by collectors who kept portions of what they collected. The Chinese couldn't testify against white people in court, a legal rule that was economic gold for wealthy employers. They could underpay Chinese workers, work them under deadly conditions, and face no legal consequences because their workers couldn't testify against them. The legal system was designed to make Chinese workers maximally exploitable. When Chinese workers tried to organize or protest conditions, wealthy employers used their control of law enforcement to suppress them. Police would break up Chinese labor organizing while protecting wealthy employers' interests. The wealthy had legal force on their side while workers had nothing. The Central Pacific Railroad's treatment of Chinese workers showed wealthy exploitation at its most brutal. The Big Four paid Chinese workers less than white workers, gave them the deadliest jobs, worked them under terrible conditions, and faced no consequences when hundreds died. They were extracting maximum labor for minimum cost because they controlled the systems that might have protected workers. Mexican Californians who'd owned land for generations were systematically dispossessed through legal theft controlled by the wealthy. The Land Commission was staffed and controlled by wealthy Americans who ruled consistently against Mexican owners. Wealthy American speculators had lawyers and bribes. Mexican families had neither. Families who'd owned ranchos for generations would lose everything to wealthy speculators who'd arrived months earlier but controlled the legal system. This wasn't justice. It was organized theft by the wealthy using law as a weapon. Native Californians faced genocide enabled and funded by wealthy-controlled government. The state paid bounties for native scalps, taxpayer money being used to fund murder that served wealthy settlers who wanted native land. The wealthy controlled the legislature that authorized this policy. The apprenticeship system that legalized enslavement of native children was designed by the wealthy to secure free labor. Wealthy families would kidnap native children legally, force them to work, and face no consequences because they controlled the system. The treatment of vulnerable populations proved that the wealthy and ruthless controlled California completely. They wrote laws to benefit themselves and hurt the vulnerable. They controlled courts that legitimized exploitation. They used law enforcement to suppress resistance. They structured legal systems to extract wealth from the powerless and transfer it to themselves. The vulnerable weren't just neglected, they were systematically exploited through wealthy-controlled systems. The period from 1855 to 1857 represents the darkest moment when wealthy elite control of California was most visible and most violent, crushing ordinary people's hopes for justice or fairness. By 1856, San Francisco was controlled by a corrupt political machine funded by gambling interests and maintained through voter fraud and intimidation. The city government existed to serve wealthy political bosses and connected businessmen. Ordinary citizens had no voice, elections were bought, officials were bribed, and justice was for sale. James King of William, a newspaper editor, began exposing this corruption in his newspaper. He documented specific cases of wealthy-controlled fraud and named the powerful men behind it. He was threatening to expose the entire system of elite control that made wealthy men richer, while ordinary San Franciscans paid the price. On May 14, 1856, James Casey, a corrupt politician protected by wealthy backers, shot and killed King in broad daylight. Casey was arrested, but everyone knew the wealthy-controlled courts would acquit him through jury tampering and bribery. The murder of a man who dared challenge elite corruption would go unpunished because the elite controlled justice. Within days, the Vigilance Committee of 1856 formed. It was organized and funded by San Francisco's wealthy merchants, the same class that controlled most of California. Over 6,000 men enrolled, armed themselves, and created a parallel government more powerful than the official one. On May 18, thousands of armed vigilantes stormed the county jail and seized Casey and another prisoner. The official government, the governor, the sheriff, the state militia, was powerless to stop them. The wealthy merchants commanding the vigilantes had more power than the elected government. This was elite control made visible. Wealthy merchants had created their own private army, seized prisoners from government custody, and nobody could stop them because they had the money, the organization, and the weapons. They were proving that real power in California belonged to the wealthy, not to democratic government. The vigilantes held their own trials and hanged Casey and others publicly. They weren't restoring justice, they were demonstrating their power. They exiled about 30 people they deemed undesirable. They controlled San Francisco absolutely for months, and the government could do nothing. Imagine being an ordinary San Franciscan watching this. The elected government you thought had authority was revealed as powerless. The wealthy merchants you worked for were running their own courts, their own prisons, their own executions. They'd literally taken over the city because they could afford to organize and arm thousands of men. The message was clear and terrifying. The wealthy controlled California so completely that they could overthrow the government when it didn't serve their interests perfectly. Democratic forms existed, but real power belonged to whoever had the most money and the willingness to use violence. The vigilante period proved everything this documentary argues. Early California was controlled by the rich and ruthless. When the normal mechanisms of elite control, corrupt officials, bought courts, controlled police, weren't enough, the wealthy simply created their own government and ruled directly through force. The darkest part wasn't the vigilante violence, it was what it revealed about who actually controlled California. For months, the facade of democratic government was dropped and the reality was visible. The wealthy ruled. They'd always ruled. They just usually did it through politicians and judges they controlled, rather than ruling directly through their private army. When the vigilantes disbanded in August 1856, they hadn't given up power. They just returned to controlling California through the official government rather than replacing it. The wealthy had proved they could take direct control whenever they wanted. That threat kept politicians compliant and ordinary people powerless. This period was the darkest because it crushed any illusion that California was anything other than an oligarchy controlled by the wealthy. The democratic forms, elections, courts, Legislatures existed, but they were theater. Real power was wealth, and the wealthy used it ruthlessly to maintain control. The difference between early California's elite-controlled system and modern California's more democratic institutions shows how much had to change to break wealthy oligarchy. Then, the wealthy directly controlled government through bribes, campaign funding, and appointment of their allies to office. Laws were written by the wealthy to benefit the wealthy. Courts ruled consistently in favor of wealthy litigants. Law enforcement protected wealthy property while ignoring crimes against the poor. Now, campaign finance regulations, transparency laws, civil service protections, and democratic oversight create some friction between wealth and political power. It's still imperfect. Wealthy interests still have disproportionate influence, but they don't own government outright the way they did in early California. Then, the wealthy could form private armies and overthrow local government when it didn't serve their interests. Vigilante committees backed by wealthy merchants could seize control of cities and rule through force with no consequences. Now, the state has effective monopoly on legitimate violence. Private militias attempting to overthrow government would face federal prosecution. The wealthy can't simply replace government with their own armed organizations. Then, courts were tools of elite control. Judges were bribed or appointed specifically to rule for the wealthy. Poor people had no access to justice. Legal outcomes were determined by who could afford better lawyers and bigger bribes. Now, courts have more independence through job security, oversight, appeals processes, and ethical rules. They're still imperfect and still favor the wealthy through better representation, but they're not openly bought the way early California courts were. Then, the wealthy could legally steal land from Mexican families, enslave native children, exploit Chinese workers without recourse, and traffic women into slavery, because the legal system they controlled permitted or enabled all of it. Now, civil rights laws, labor protections, anti-discrimination statutes, and human trafficking prosecutions create legal protections for vulnerable populations. They're imperfectly enforced, but they exist as law rather than being absent entirely. Then, workers had no rights, no protections, no recourse against deadly working conditions or wage theft. The wealthy controlled all economic systems and used that control to extract maximum labor for minimum compensation. Now, labor laws, workplace safety regulations, minimum wage, workers' compensation, and unionization rights give workers legal protections and bargaining power. The wealthy still have enormous advantages, but workers aren't completely powerless. The transformation required breaking wealthy control through reform movements, labor organizing, progressive legislation, and federal intervention. It took decades of struggle to build democratic institutions that could resist complete elite capture. Early California was controlled by the rich and ruthless, and that's not historical hyperbole. It's documented fact proven by how the wealthy structured every system to extract wealth from ordinary people while protecting themselves from consequences. The wealthy didn't just have more money. They used that money to buy judges, bribe officials, control law enforcement, manipulate land titles, monopolize water and supplies, and crush anyone who challenged their control. They turned California's government and legal system into tools for maintaining elite power and extracting wealth from everyone else. Thousands of ordinary people came to California dreaming of opportunity. They found instead a system rigged by the rich to ensure they stayed poor while their labor, and whatever wealth they found, flowed to the wealthy elite who controlled the mechanisms of power. The miners who worked themselves to exhaustion, while wealthy claim jumpers stole their claims through corrupt courts. The workers who died in wealthy-owned mines and railroads, while the owners faced no consequences. The Mexican families who lost land their ancestors had owned for generations to wealthy American speculators. The Chinese workers exploited under deadly conditions by wealthy railroad magnates. The women trafficked into slavery while wealthy officials looked away. The the children forced into labor to enrich wealthy employers. All of them were victims of a system controlled by the rich and ruthless, a system designed by the wealthy, operated by the wealthy, and maintained through the wealthy's complete control of law, government, and force. The California that emerged from this era was shaped by this elite control. The wealthy families who built fortunes through exploitation and theft became California's establishment, their names still on buildings, their descendants still influential, their stolen wealth still generating power. Understanding this history matters because it shows how oligarchy actually works, not through conspiracy, but through the wealthy systematically using their resources to control the institutions that govern society. It shows what happens when the rich can buy justice, bribe government, and use law as a weapon while claiming to operate within a democratic system. Modern California still struggles with wealth inequality and elite influence, but it's not the same complete oligarchy that early California was. That changed only through sustained democratic resistance to elite control, labor organizing, reform movements, progressive legislation, federal intervention, and generations of people fighting to make California's democracy more than a facade. The people who suffered under elite control in early California deserved better. They deserved courts that delivered justice regardless of wealth. They deserved government that served the public, not the rich. They deserved legal protections and economic systems that rewarded honest work rather than extracting wealth for elite benefit. Remember them when someone romanticizes the freedom of the Old West or argues for returning to minimal government and unregulated markets. Early California shows us exactly what those systems produce, not freedom and opportunity, but oligarchy controlled by the rich and ruthless. If this documentary changed how you understand California's history and the relationship between wealth and power, share it. And if you want to explore how other states develop their own systems of elite control or democratic resistance, stick around. Every state's history teaches us something about how power really works and who it serves. Thanks for watching.